Every time regular show got surprisingly dark, there is a scene easy to miss if you were only half watching, the way most of us were only half watching, where a man made of light picks up his dead father's ashes in an urn shaped like a trucker hat and drives through the night to spread them somewhere. His father always wanted to be honored, and along the way, the ghost of that same father rises up out of the road to take violent revenge on the men who mocked him in life. That is a Tuesday afternoon cartoon about a raccoon and a blue jay who work at a park. I am Velvo, and tonight we are going all the way down into every place regular show quietly stopped being a joke, sat with something real for a few unbearable seconds, and then, without ever announcing it, kept going as if nothing had happened. This isn't a highlight reel of jump scares. It's something closer to an excavation, one layer at a time, of a show that most people remember as gentle background noise for their 20s, and that turns out, once you actually look at what it did across 8 seasons, to have been carrying an enormous amount of real weight the entire time, weight it never asked its audience to brace for in advance. Let's get into it. The premise of regular show, on the surface, could not be simpler. Mordecai, a blue jay in his 20s, and Rigby, a raccoon the same age, work as groundskeepers at a public park owned by a gruff businessman named Mr. Maillard and managed day to day by Benson, a perpetually furious gumball machine. They slack off. They get sent on errands. The errands spiral into cosmic nonsense, involving cosmic entities, video game gods, arm wrestling deals with death himself, and by the end of the 22 minutes, the universe has usually been saved, and nothing much has changed. It ran on Cartoon Network from Septembers of 2010 to January of 2017, 8 seasons, 261 episodes, created by J.G. Quintel, a CalArts graduate who based the whole thing loosely on his own 20s, spent working a job he didn't take very seriously. That's the pitch. That's what the poster looks like. And underneath that pitch, again and again, in ways that snuck past most people who were only halfway paying attention while it played in the background of some dorm room or some apartment at 2 a.m, the show kept finding its way into genuinely dark, genuinely heavy, genuinely adult territory, and then walking back out of it so smoothly that you almost convinced yourself you hadn't seen what you'd just seen. Tonight we're going through those moments. Not the jump scares, not the monster of the week stuff that was always meant to be a little scary in a fun Saturday morning way. The other kind. The kind where the show, for just a few seconds or sometimes for a whole episode, stopped pretending it was only a comedy and let something genuinely sad, genuinely violent, or genuinely existential stand in the middle of the frame with nowhere to hide. We should start with the one that most casual viewers half remember without ever quite processing what they were looking at, because it happened early, in the show's second season, tucked into an episode that sounds, on paper, like the lightest kind of premise imaginable. Grave Sites aired in May of 2011, and its setup is almost aggressively innocent. Mordecai and Rigby want a paid day off, so they pitch Benson on hosting an outdoor movie night in the park's old, mostly forgotten cemetery, a fundraiser built around a schlocky zombie film called Zombocalypse 3D, complete with rented projector equipment and boxes of the cheap red and blue paper glasses that never actually work. It is, up until a certain point, a perfectly gentle little episode about community fundraising and cheap horror movie parody. And then the projector, damaged in an accident, sends a cascade of electrical sparks down into the earth beneath the actual graves the movie is being projected over, and the sparks do exactly what you'd expect them to do in a story that's been quietly building toward this the whole time. They reach the coffins, and the dead climb back out of the ground. What follows plays out with a level of commitment to real zombie horror grammar that is almost startling to watch again as an adult, drawing visibly, and this has been noted by fans cataloging the episode's references on the visual language of Night of the Living Dead and Return of the Living Dead, right down to a hulking, nearly indestructible final zombie clearly built in the image of the armored tank enemy type from the video game Left 4 Dead. Skips at one point delivers what should be an incapacitating blow directly to one of the reanimated dead, and it does nothing at all, the zombie simply absorbing the hit and continuing forward, which is a small detail, but it's the show quietly signaling to its audience that the usual rules, the ones where a well-timed kick solves the problem, don't apply here. The bodies of actual dead people, interred in actual graves within the park's own boundaries, are shown climbing up out of the earth on a children's cartoon in service of a fundraiser plot, and the episode never once steps back to acknowledge how strange that juxtaposition is. It just moves forward, the way it always does, letting the horror sit exactly as heavy as horror sits, before wrapping the whole thing up in time for Benson to happily hand over the promised day off. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it establishes something the show would return to constantly across its run: an almost total lack of tonal warning before the drop. There's no ominous score cue 30 seconds before the zombies rise. No visual language telling a young viewer, now it's about to get scary, brace yourself. The show simply lets its lightest, silliest premises curdle into something genuinely unsettling with almost no runway, and then, just as quickly, lets them curdle back into comedy once the immediate crisis resolves. It's a structural sleight of hand that, once you notice it, explains why so much of regular show's darkness catches people off guard even on a rewatch. You know, intellectually, that something bad is coming. You still don't feel it coming until it's already happened. We should move next into the place the show gave itself the most explicit permission to go dark, because it happens every year starting in the show's third season, and because it is filed, structurally, under the show's annual horror anthology, which gives you a kind of permission slip walking in. Every year starting in season 3, regular show did a Halloween special called Terror Tales of the Park, an anthology format the creators have said, and which multiple entertainment outlets have confirmed was directly inspired by The Simpsons' Treehouse of Horror tradition. There were 6 of these specials across the show's run, each one a set of short, scary stories told by the cast to each other, and the show itself treats them as explicitly non-canon, meaning, and this is a detail worth sitting with, that inside these specific episodes, Characters are allowed to actually die, not almost die, not get better by the next scene, die, and stay dead because the events don't count against the show's regular continuity. That's a strange thing for a network to greenlight for an all-ages afternoon slot, and it's stranger still how far the show pushed it once it had that permission. The very first Terror Tales of the Park, which aired in October of 2011, opens with Pops telling an intentionally lame story about a doll that likes to draw on people's faces, which the rest of the cast openly mocks him for. That segment, called Creepy Doll, is explicitly framed by the show itself as a loose parody of Child's Play, with a beloved childhood toy named Percy coming back to life, and it's worth noting the specific joke the show builds around it. Everyone in the room, including the audience, is primed by decades of horror movie convention to expect a killer doll story, and what Pops actually delivers is comically undersized, a doll whose worst crime is an unusual desire to mark on things. It's the show's own joke about the gap between the horror genre's expectations and Pops's genuinely gentle inner nature, and it works specifically because the segment that follows it, Muscle Man's contribution, called Death Metal Crash Pit, refuses to pull that same punch. That story follows Muscle Man and High Five Ghost as they're stalked and eventually assaulted by the vengeful spirits of a long-dead hair metal band haunting the interior of an RV, playing the whole thing with the visual and sonic language of a legitimate possession horror film rather than a parody of one. The special's third and final segment, In the House, follows Mordecai dressed as a father with 5 fake children strapped on, an elaborate scheme purely to maximize candy haul on Halloween night, before the segment turns the screws on him specifically, trapping him inside a house that begins slowly and without any clear rules governing how far it will go, replacing pieces of him the longer he stays inside it, playing less like a joke and more like a genuine slow-building dread piece, the kind of thing you'd expect from an anthology horror show aimed at adults, not a Saturday morning lineup. And it set a pattern. Every year after that, at least one segment in each Halloween special would go somewhere the main show never let itself go during the other 51 weeks of the year. Take the second one, Terror Tales of the Park 2, which aired in 2012. One of its segments, called Payback, is narrated by Mordecai, and it is, by any honest description, a ghost story about guilt. Mordecai is haunted by the spirit of his uncle after accidentally causing his death, an accident the show stages with an almost farcical specificity, knocking him into the ball return mechanism at a bowling alley, and the segment plays the haunting completely straight afterward, no punchline, no last-second reveal that softens it. The ghost doesn't want revenge in any traditional horror movie sense. He wants something smaller and stranger and, in its own way, more unsettling. He keeps appearing specifically to collect on a $5 debt Mordecai owed him from before he died, an ordinary petty piece of unfinished business that has apparently followed him past the boundary of death itself, because that's sometimes what actually lingers after somebody's gone, not the big unresolved feelings, but the small unpaid ones. A man is dead because of something the protagonist did, and the protagonist cannot escape that fact, literally manifesting in front of him, demanding $5, and the show lets the discomfort of that premise sit in the room rather than rushing past it. Another segment from that same special, Party Bus, follows Mordecai, Rigby, Eileen, and Margaret boarding a bus that ages them forward in time as it drives, which is a premise that sounds whimsical until you actually watch what it does, which is show these still young characters confronting, in miniature, what it will feel like to watch their lives run out from inside a vehicle they can't get off of. That's not a haunted house gag. That's existential horror dressed up as a Halloween bit, the kind of thing you'd expect a prestige anthology show to attempt, not a cartoon about park groundskeepers. If you're watching this right now, lying in the dark somewhere, go ahead and drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time it is on your end. I like knowing where these words are landing while you drift off. Now, back into it. That second Halloween special, Terror Tales of the Park 2, is worth lingering on a little longer because its third and final segment, Wallpaper Man, told by Benson specifically as a pointed act of pettiness aimed at his own two least reliable employees, ends up being one of the more grotesque short pieces the show ever produced. The setup is almost aggressively domestic. Mordecai and Rigby damage a section of hallway wallpaper. Benson demands they repaper the entire house to match, and rather than do the work themselves, they call a number advertised on the television for a contractor named Jan the Wallpaper Man, who offers to do the job for free. Jan turns out to be an enormous, predatory spider, capable of speech and charm right up until he isn't, and the segment escalates from home improvement comedy into a genuine creature horror sequence, trapping Pops directly against a wall, mid-scream, and then trapping the rest of the staff, Benson included, suspended from the ceiling in a cave built entirely from more of Jan's wallpaper-like webbing. Rigby, in a detail the show plants specifically to pay off later in the series, is revealed here to be severely claustrophobic, and his panic, tearing frantically at the walls of a shrinking room that TV tropes and other outlets note, is staged using a genuine optical illusion to make the space feel like it's actively closing in around the characters, is played completely straight as real fear rather than comic exaggeration. And when Mordecai and Rigby finally attempt to kill Jan by pulling the pins on a package of live grenades and shoving the whole thing down his throat, they do it while still trapped inside his grasp, meaning their own plan to save themselves goes off with them still attached to the thing they're trying to destroy. Benson's own framing of the story, once it's over, is nakedly hostile. He tells it specifically to make Mordecai and Rigby look as stupid and reckless as possible, and the story's climax makes that hostility literal rather than metaphorical, ending, as one recap plainly documents, with the two of them dying in a graphic explosion inside the spider's body. But it's the outer frame of that same Halloween special, the one holding all three ghost stories together, that delivers the single darkest, driest little joke of the entire episode, almost as an afterthought. As the park gang drives, lost, toward the Halloween party they're trying to reach, Rigby starts telling his own story about how dumb Benson is, gets into a physical shoving match with the tow truck driver over being told to stop, and the resulting crash sends the entire vehicle into a tree, killing everyone inside instantly. They all become ghosts on the spot. Benson, true to form, immediately fires Rigby for causing the accident, and Rigby's response, delivered with the same bored, deadpan energy the show gives all of its funniest lines, is simply to point out that being fired doesn't mean much anymore since he's already dead. And then, having killed off its entire main cast in the span of about 10 seconds of screen time, the show cuts straight to everyone arriving at the Halloween party as if nothing at all had happened, the joke resolving itself purely through tonal whiplash rather than any actual explanation. That's the show's Halloween special logic, distilled down to its purest form. Genuine, unceremonious death, treated with less emotional weight than a missed bus, immediately followed by the party continuing exactly on schedule. By the fourth installment, in 2014, the framing device itself had become something worth noticing, because the special has the whole park gang driving out to visit Muscle Man's mother on Halloween night, trading stories along the way, specifically to keep Muscle Man awake at the wheel, which means the entire structure of the episode is built around a real, mundane human fear, the fear of a friend falling asleep behind the wheel of a moving car, wrapped in a shell of supernatural short stories. Pops's contribution to that special, called The Hole, follows a premise that plays on claustrophobia and consumption in a way that is genuinely unsettling for a show whose mascot character wears a lollipop for a head. The show's writers were not being lazy with these anthologies. They were using the 1 week a year where the rules didn't apply to test exactly how far into real horror they could take characters the audience had spent years falling asleep to. The 5th and 6th installments, airing in 2015 and 2016 respectively, lean even further into science fiction dread, with segments explicitly built around the themes of technological horror and cosmic isolation, matching the show's own late series pivot towards space and existential stakes, which we'll get to. The 6th and final installment, Terror Tales of the Park 6, which aired in October of 2016 during the show's 8th and last season, gathers the crew in the house sitting atop the mysterious dome that had, by that point, enclosed the entire park for most of the season and lets them tell stories with an explicitly science fiction bent rather than the traditional ghost story format. Segments with titles like Fear Planet, King-Sized Candy Bars, and Alien Roommate, credited to a rotating team of writers, including Sean Glaze, Owen Dennis, Minty Lewis, and Ryan Pequin, each one bending the anthology format toward body horror and isolation rather than haunted house tropes, a clear signal that the writer's idea of what counted as frightening had shifted right alongside the show's own widening cosmology. It's worth noting, and this is documented plainly on the show's episode guides and fan wiki records rather than being a matter of interpretation, that these specials kept escalating in tone right up through the final season, meaning the show's appetite for genuine horror never dulled. It just kept finding new vocabularies to express it in, moving from ghost stories to alien abduction stories to stories about consciousness and memory as the show's own cosmology got stranger. And there is a structural detail about the anthology format worth mentioning too, because it tells you something about how deliberately the network treated this material. The individual segments were sometimes broadcast separately, outside of the Halloween season, stripped of their framing device entirely, meaning a kid could tune in on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in March and catch Payback or In the House, completely divorced from the safety of, oh, it's the Halloween special, this is supposed to be spooky, landing instead as just another regular episode of the show, no different in principle from an episode about a video game tournament. But if the Halloween specials were the show's officially sanctioned space to go dark, the canon episodes found their own quieter, more devastating ways to do it, and none of them land harder, in my opinion, than Trucker Hall of Fame, which aired in June of 2012, right in the middle of the show's third season, tucked in among a run of much sillier episodes about video games and pranks. The setup is almost aggressively casual. Muscle Man is on the phone with his father, whom the show and the fandom both refer to affectionately as Muscle Dad, trying to wish him a happy Father's Day, when his brother interrupts to deliver the news, delivered with the bluntness the show reserves for its darkest beats, that their father is dead. The show doesn't soften the mechanism of death either. Muscle Dad died, we learn, after he pulled one of his signature pranks, putting a cactus under what he believed was a costumed police officer, only for the costume to turn out to be an actual bear. He was mauled. That is the literal, stated cause of death for a recurring, beloved supporting character on a children's cartoon, and the show says it out loud, in a joke that Muscle Man himself delivers through tears at the funeral, because the show understood something true about grief, which is that the absurd and the devastating often arrive in the same sentence, that people cope by making the death itself into the last joke the person ever told. What follows is one of the most quietly moving road trip structures the show ever built. Benson, who spends most of the series either yelling or on the verge of yelling, is uncharacteristically gentle in this episode, asking Mordecai and Rigby to accompany Muscle Man on the drive to spread his father's ashes, specifically because, as Benson explains, High Five Ghost, Muscle Man's actual best friend, doesn't deal well with this sort of thing. That single line does an enormous amount of work. It tells you, without ever showing you directly, that grief is not evenly distributed among friends, that some people in your life will be able to sit with you in the worst of it, and some won't, and that the ones who can't aren't villains for that, they're just differently built. During the drive, Muscle Man tells Mordecai and Rigby that his father was, in his memory, one of the greatest truckers who ever lived, and the show lets us sit inside that inherited myth for a while before it pulls the rug, when a group of actual truckers reveal that Muscle Dad was never a trucker at all. He was a forklift operator. He invented the entire trucker mythology for his son's benefit, so that Muscle Man would have a father he could be proud of, a father whose job sounded impressive enough to brag about, and he kept up that lie for Muscle Man's entire childhood, all the way until his own death, at which point Muscle Man discovers a letter his father had written and hidden away in advance, apparently anticipating this exact reveal, which reads, in part, an apology for the deception, an explanation that he only did it to toughen his son up for a world that was, in the father's words, a harsh place, and an admission that now Muscle Man knows the truth. It's a letter written by a father who understood he was dying, or at least understood that the lie couldn't hold forever, preparing a confession he'd never have to deliver in person. And the moment, because this is still nominally a comedy, the episode ends with the Ashes reanimating Muscle Dad's ghost, who proceeds to take violent revenge on the truckers who mocked him in life for being only a forklift operator, sending their rig off a cliff in an explosion. The show holds both of those things at once, without contradiction. A father's decades-long compassionate lie to protect his son's self-image, and a ghost getting bloody satisfaction against the men who looked down on him. That combination, tenderness braided directly into violence, is something Regular Show does better than almost any other cartoon of its era, and Trucker Hall of Fame is maybe the cleanest single example of it in the entire run. If Muscle Dad's death is the show's clearest example of grief hiding inside comedy, then Skip's Story, which aired in April of 2014 during the show's 5th season, is the clearest example of the show building an entire tragic love story and then detonating it in real time on screen in front of an audience of children. Skips, for most of the show's run, is presented as the park's elder statesman, an immortal Yeti-adjacent handyman who fixes everything, knows everything, and moves through the world by skipping rather than walking, which the show plays for years as a running gag before ever explaining it. Skip's Story is the episode where the show cashes that joke in, and it cashes it in as hard as it possibly can. We learn, in flashback, that Skips was once an ordinary young man named Walks, attending an ordinary high school, in love with a woman named Mona, voiced in the episode by an actress. The fandom and multiple review outlets have noted brought real weight to a small amount of screen time. Walks and Mona's romance plays out with the visual grammar of a nostalgic teen drama, right down to explicit Back to the Future homages in the design of the school and its authority figures. And then, on prom night, during a confrontation with a cosmic bully named Clorgbane, Mona is killed, the reviewer at the AV Club, writing about the episode at the time, noted something worth repeating here plainly, that the show seemed to be brushing right up against the edge of what a network aimed at children would normally allow, and that the death itself happens so fast, is shown in so little explicit detail, that it almost doesn't fully register before the story has already moved past it. The way real trauma sometimes doesn't fully register until the moment has already passed you by. What the episode does with the aftermath is where the real weight sits. A devastated, grief-shattered Walks is approached by the guardians of eternal youth, a cosmic order who offer him immortality, and Walks accepts, explicitly because, as the framing makes clear, he has nothing left to lose. Grief, in this telling, is not just an emotion the character processes and moves past. It's the actual mechanism by which he becomes the character we've known for years. His immortality is not a superpower he was born with or trained for. It is the direct, causal result of losing the one person he loved enough to make him willing to give up ever getting to die. When the Guardian asks what name he wants to be reborn into, Walks thinks of the private nickname Mona used to call him, from a memory of skipping across the school grounds together, and chooses Skips, permanently renaming himself after the last unbroken piece of joy he ever shared with her. And the episode's final scene, back at the present-day park, shows an older, fully immortal Skips pulling out a locket Mona had once given him, containing her photograph, and shedding a single tear before returning to work, having just told this entire story to two visibly shaken young co-workers who, by the episode's own closing beat, walk away saying only that they're grateful not to be immortal themselves, unable to fully process what they've just heard. That is the show's structure for grief in miniature. Something enormous happens to someone you love. They tell you about it once, and then everyone quietly goes back to work, because that is, in fact, what most people actually do with the worst things that ever happened to them. It's worth pausing here on a detail the show treats almost as an aside, but which recontextualizes years of prior episodes once you know it. Every 157 years, Skips is bound to fight Clorgbane again, the same being responsible for Mona's death, which the show had already dramatized once before in Season 3's Fists of Justice, without at that point explaining any of the history behind it. That means audiences who watched Fists of Justice first, which most did, since it aired more than a year earlier, were watching an already established and emotional rematch without knowing it was one, and only Skip's story retroactively revealed that Skip's fight with Clorgbane wasn't just another cosmic threat of the week. It was an anniversary of the worst night of his life, one he is cosmically obligated to relive on a fixed clock forever. That's not a small world-building footnote. That's the show quietly telling you that immortality in this universe isn't a gift. It's a sentence, one that requires you to keep fighting the same battle that took everything from you on a schedule you don't control for as long as the universe exists. Watched again with that context in hand, Fists of Justice becomes a considerably heavier piece of comedy than it plays as the first time through. The plot, as originally aired, has Mordecai and Rigby accidentally crushing Skip's hands, mundanely, almost farcically, by slamming a harpsichord lid on his fingers while he's doing them a favor on the exact same day, unbeknownst to either of them, that he's due to fight Clorgbane again after a century and a half of waiting. Skips never explains what the fight actually means to him. He simply accepts the injury, tells the two of them not to worry about it, and goes to face his oldest enemy with broken hands anyway, which means he loses quickly and completely in front of the cosmic order he belongs to. One of his fellow guardians, a character named Archibald, steps in to defend him and is annihilated on the spot for the attempt. It's only Mordecai and Rigby, discovering that the golden gauntlets Skips was meant to fight with function, structurally, like the controls of a video game they already know how to play, who managed to finish the fight in his place and send Clorgbane back into exile. Watched without the later reveal, it's a fun, self-contained action episode with real stakes and a satisfying twist. watched with the knowledge of what Skip's story tells us 2 years later, it becomes something else entirely, an immortal man, quietly carrying the anniversary of the worst night of his life, injured through no fault of his own on the one day he needed his body most, walking into a fight he must have known, on some level, he could no longer win, and losing in exactly the way that must have felt, privately, like losing Mona all over again, in front of an audience of two 20-somethings who had no idea what they were actually watching. There's a second layer to Skips's immortality worth naming carefully, and I want to flag clearly which part of it is documented and which part is the kind of quiet extrapolation the show invites without ever stating outright. What's documented, stated plainly across the show's canon material, and repeated in its own dialogue at various points, is that Skips has been working specifically at this park since at least 1873, a detail delivered almost as a throwaway line, and that he belongs to an order called the Guardians of Eternal Youth, cosmic peers who appear only rarely across the show's run, treated with the gravity of an old, established institution rather than a novelty cameo. What isn't stated outright, but which the show leans into so consistently that it's hard not to notice, is the sheer scale of what a life that long actually costs a person emotionally. An immortal being who has spent a century and a half in the same physical location has necessarily watched everyone else who ever worked there die. Every Benson before this Benson, every set of 20-something slackers before Mordecai and Rigby, every angry, overworked middle manager, every green-skinned prankster, every ghost. The show never spells this out as tragedy, exactly, but it doesn't need to, because it's baked directly into the premise the moment you sit with it. The calm, patient, unbothered demeanor the show gives Skips for 8 seasons isn't just a character trait, it's what's left over after watching this specific cycle of loss repeat itself for longer than most countries have existed. He isn't detached because nothing gets to him. He's detached, or at least appears to be, because he has already grieved this exact configuration of people in one shape or another more times than the show or its audience will ever be shown. I want to be equally careful about what's speculation here, because a lot of the show's fandom has taken this pattern further than the text itself confirms. It's a genuinely popular reading, discussed at length across fan forums and wiki-talk pages, that Skips's calm is closer to a survival mechanism than a personality trait, that the show is quietly suggesting immortality without companionship is its own specific, slow-burning form of horror, one the show never dramatizes directly, because doing so would require making its most reassuring adult character into its saddest one, and the show, at least in its regular canon episodes, seems reluctant to go that far on the page. That reading is plausible. It's consistent with everything the show does show us, but it remains an inference built on top of documented facts, rather than something Skip's story or any other episode states in so many words, and it's worth holding it the way the show itself seems to want you to hold most of its heaviest implications, as something true underneath the surface, rather than something confirmed on it. Death himself deserves his own extended stop on this walk through the park's darker corners, because the show's relationship with him is one of its stranger, sustained choices. He first appears, notably, in Over the Top, an episode from the show's second season, in a storyline that is worth stating plainly because of how casually the show treats it. Skips, in a fit of jealous rage during an arm wrestling contest, accidentally kills Rigby. Not injures, kills. And the resolution to that plot is that Skips must personally arm wrestle death, the literal embodiment of mortality, in order to win Rigby's life back. The show frames this with the same energy it would use for a contest over a parking spot, treating the actual death of a main character as a plot beat to be resolved through a game, which folds neatly into a pattern we'll come back to later. This is a universe where death is negotiable, where the actual line between the living and the dead is something you can bargain across if you're clever or lucky, or friends with the right immortal Yeti. Death himself is voiced with a kind of world-weary British biker energy, leather jacket and motorcycle included, and the show gives him a wife and a son named Thomas, humanizing the personification of the end of all things into a guy with a family and, implicitly, a home to go back to after every shift spent collecting souls. He shows up at Muscle Man's wedding later in the series. He's present in the finale, fighting alongside the park staff against the forces trying to unmake reality. And there's a smaller, stranger example of that same negotiable relationship with death worth mentioning here, one that the show itself only clarifies well after the fact. A recurring group of antagonists, known as the Capicola Gang, seemingly killed off in an earlier season, are absent specifically from the mass villain resurrection in Exit 9B, and it's only in a later episode, Stake Me Amadeus, that the show reveals why. They were never actually dead at all. They'd simply survived their apparent deaths and gone into hiding, waiting out of view until it suited the story to bring them back. That's a small continuity choice, but it says something about how loosely this universe actually holds the line between alive and not alive. Even the show's own villains, minor as they are, get to come back from a death the audience had every reason to believe was final, because in the world of regular show, very few doors, even the last one, ever really stay closed. He is, by the time the show ends, less an antagonist and more a recurring acquaintance who happens to have the single heaviest job description in the entire cosmology, and the show never lets that job feel light, even while it plays his appearances for laughs. What's genuinely striking, sitting with this character across the show's whole run, is how deliberately the writers refused to let death be only a function. He has a son named Thomas, introduced across multiple episodes as an ordinary child living an ordinary domestic life, with two parents, one of whom happens to personally collect the souls of the newly deceased for a living. The show never plays this for existential horror the way another series might. It plays it as warmth, as an argument, made gently and without fanfare, that even the personification of the end of everything gets to come home from work, gets to worry about an ordinary kid's ordinary problems, gets to be tired and patient, and a little short-tempered the way any parent gets after a long shift. That's a genuinely unusual choice for how to characterize mortality itself inside a children's cartoon, and it pays off specifically in the moments where death relents, where he bends a rule he technically shouldn't bend because a park employee begged hard enough or loved someone enough to make the ask. A father understands. On some level, the show never explains, but never needs to, what people will do for the ones they love, because he is one. The universe of regular show, in other words, imagines death itself as something capable of being reasoned with, specifically because it has also, in its own life, done some of the same unreasonable things love makes any of us do. Before we get to the biggest single escalation in the show's stakes, I want to stop on something smaller and stranger because it's the kind of dark that hides inside a genre the show almost never touched otherwise: the Christmas special. The Christmas special aired in December of 2012 during the same fourth season as Exit 9B, and it gave the show one of its most unusual pieces of casting, bringing in Ed Asner in one of his final voice roles before his death nearly a decade later, to play a version of Santa Claus who looks nothing like the version most children grow up expecting. This Santa has long hair tied back in a ponytail, wears a black jacket left open over a red shirt, and speaks with the same gravel-voiced authority Asner brought to every role he ever played, dismissing the standard mythology outright by telling Mordecai and Rigby directly that television producers invented the version of him people think they know. What starts as a fun subversion of the character quickly turns into something considerably heavier. We learn that Santa's former lead toy designer, an elf named Quilgan, had spent his career developing what he believed was his life's greatest achievement, an ordinary-looking gift box that, when opened, would conjure up exactly whatever its holder desired most. And we learn, in the same breath, why Santa had it destroyed. The box's power wasn't benevolent. It ran on what the show's own dialogue plainly calls dark magic, and in an early focus group test conducted on Christmas morning, the box turned ordinary, presumably kind people violently against one another, each person fighting to keep possession of a device that could grant any wish, because the show understands something true about unlimited desire, which is that it corrupts faster than it satisfies. Santa ordered the project shut down and the prototype locked away, and Quilgan, watching his life's work destroyed in front of him, turned against his former employer entirely, becoming, in the show's own framing, Santa's literal arch-enemy, a betrayed former colleague, seeking revenge specifically for having his life's purpose taken from him. The episode's climax escalates into open violence. Quilgan shoots the lock off Santa's own workshop to steal the box back. The two of them fight directly over the sleigh at the edge of the North Pole's outer limits, and the episode ultimately requires the entire park staff to venture into an abandoned mine shaft to throw the corrupted gift into a literal pool of molten lava, the only substance capable of destroying it, staged with what the AV Club's contemporaneous review described, without exaggeration, as a genuinely chilling sequence, showing Christmas itself flickering out of existence across the world, while the traditional strains of Carol of the Bells play over the montage, before Mordecai, in the episode's actual climax, throws himself bodily into the pit alongside Quilgan and the box to guarantee its destruction. A children's Christmas special, in other words, built its entire structure around a workplace betrayal, a weaponized object that turns kindness into violence the instant it's granted unlimited power, and a hero's willingness to die in a pit of lava to stop it, all wrapped in the recognizable shape of a holiday cartoon. There's a smaller, gentler detail tucked into that same episode worth mentioning too, because it shows the show applying its usual compassion even to a character who spends most of his screen time being an obstacle. Gene, the gruff manager of a rival park, who initially refuses to help Mordecai and Rigby reach the mine shaft, is eventually shown a photograph of himself with his wife and child, and it's that photograph, that small, unglamorous evidence of an ordinary family life, that changes his mind and gets him to help. Even in an episode built around a betrayed toy maker turned arch-villain, the show couldn't resist reminding its audience that the man standing in your way probably has people he loves waiting for him at home too, and that this, more than any argument or threat, is usually the thing that actually moves someone to do the right thing. That the show could deliver all of that and still land, by the numbers, as one of its most beloved single episodes tells you something about how well audiences of every age had already been trained by that point in the run to expect real weight hiding behind the show's most disarming premises. Before we get there, though, it's worth going back to where the whole conflict actually started, because Garrett Bobby Ferguson's death, the one his son spends the entirety of Exit 9B trying to avenge, is one of the show's stranger, blunter pieces of dark comedy, and it comes from a genuinely surprising real-world source. High Score, which aired in February of 2011 during the show's second season, introduces Garrett Bobby Ferguson as the reigning universe record holder for a fictional arcade game called Broken Bones, a character whose entire identity is built around a decades-old high score he's grown grotesquely possessive of, cheating outright, fabricating a tearful sob story to manipulate the crowd's sympathy, and physically attacking Mordecai and Rigby mid-match to protect his title from being taken. What makes the episode worth pulling apart is a piece of real-world context the show's own fans and multiple entertainment outlets have documented plainly. Garrett Bobby Ferguson was written as a fairly direct parody of Billy Mitchell, the real competitive gamer famous for holding a long-disputed high-score record in classic arcade games like Donkey Kong, and Mitchell, taking the resemblance personally, actually filed a lawsuit against Cartoon Network over his likeness being used without permission, a lawsuit that was ultimately thrown out of court. That's documented fact, not fan speculation, and it's a strange, almost funny footnote until you sit with what actually happens to the character inside the episode itself. Once Mordecai and Rigby finally beat his record fair and square, Garrett Bobby Ferguson doesn't simply lose gracefully. He dies on screen in an explosion of goo, undone completely by the loss of a video game score he had built his entire sense of self around. It's a joke about obsession taken to its most literal, most visceral conclusion, a man so thoroughly defined by a number on a screen that losing it kills him outright. And that death is precisely the wound Garrett Bobby Ferguson Jr. spends Exit 9B trying to avenge. An entire cosmic assault on the park, mass memory erasure, dozens of resurrected villains, all of it in service of a son's grief and rage over a father who quite literally exploded because two 20-something slackers beat his high score. A father's family, a friendship split into two selves fighting over the same body, a boss who reveals himself as literally demonic, a holiday special that ends in a pool of lava. It's worth pausing here before we go any further into the show's biggest escalations, just to notice how much of this darkness lives in the show's smallest, most disposable corners, rather than its marquee episodes. Nobody sat down to watch regular show expecting a rumination on grief, on inherited trauma, on the specific loneliness of loving someone for centuries after they're gone. Those things arrived anyway, folded into premises about arcade games and Christmas gifts and interior decorating, because the writers seemed to understand, whether they'd have put it in these words or not, that comedy and grief have always shared the same house. You don't get one without eventually bumping into the other if you stay in the room long enough. Regular show simply stayed in the room longer than most shows its size were willing to. Now we should talk about Exit 9B itself, because if you want a single episode that best demonstrates how far regular show was willing to escalate its stakes by its fourth season, in October of 2012, this is the one. The premise, stripped down, sounds almost too dark to say out loud. A new intern named Thomas arrives at the park for his first day, only to walk into what the show's own opening sequence stages as an apocalyptic assault, complete with a genuinely unsettling dark remix of the show's usually cheerful theme music playing over explosions, laser fire, and the sight of Benson, Pops, and High Five Ghost running in open terror before being struck down in front of the new employee's eyes. We learn the attacker is Garrett Bobby Ferguson Jr., the son of a previously defeated video game villain, seeking revenge for his father's death, an inherited grudge passed down like an heirloom of grief and rage. His plan, and this is stated plainly in the episode, rather than being a matter of reading between lines, is to construct a literal portal to the underworld through a highway exit ramp, resurrecting dozens of the show's previously defeated villains, including his own dead father, specifically to destroy everything Mordecai and Rigby have ever cared about. Along the way, the rest of the park staff, except Mordecai and Rigby, who escape into the near future via a time machine, are brainwashed, their memories erased so completely that when they encounter each other later, they don't recognize their own coworkers, their own closest friends, at all. Skips, brainwashed, physically grabs Mordecai and Rigby by the throat and pins them to a wall, no longer able to recognize the two people he's spent years protecting, and only breaks free of the conditioning when Rigby invokes the memory of Mona, the one wound in Skips's long life, apparently powerful enough to punch through even total memory erasure. That detail alone tells you something quietly devastating about how the show now understood its own supporting cast. Grief, specifically Skips's specific grief for a specific woman who died decades or centuries earlier, had become the emotional bedrock stable enough to survive even a total identity wipe. The episode ends after an enormous battle sequence, drawing in nearly every ally the show had built up across its run, death included, with the 6 buried park staff members freed and the highway project halted. But the show doesn't let you leave without noticing what it just did to its own supporting cast for 22 minutes. Total memory annihilation, mass casualties among named characters, even if temporary within canon, and a villain whose entire motivation is inherited generational grief weaponized into a plan for mass destruction. That's not incidental Saturday morning peril. That's the structure of a revenge tragedy, borrowed wholesale and dropped into a show about lawn maintenance. There's a feature-length example of the same instinct, and it's easy to forget it exists at all because it never aired as a normal weekly episode. Regular Show, the movie, released digitally in September of 2015 and given its television premiere that November, is a 68-minute time travel story, and it takes the show's usual willingness to let friendship curdle into something painful and stretches it across an entire feature runtime rather than a single 22-minute episode. The plot opens with a dying, future version of Rigby crashing his time ship into the present-day park to deliver a warning. He and Mordecai, back in high school, built a time machine that malfunctioned and spawned a self-sustaining space and time-traveling tornado, one that a bitter former teacher and volleyball coach named Mr. Ross, blamed and imprisoned for the original incident, has since weaponized into a device capable of erasing the entirety of time itself. But the detail that actually makes the movie land as something darker than a typical adventure plot arrives once the past version of events gets forced into the open in a sequence the show's own fandom has tagged, accurately, as a painful confession. Rigby, back in high school, was rejected from the college the two of them had planned to attend together. Mordecai was accepted, and rather than let his best friend go, rather than face that gap honestly, Rigby forged the rejection letter Mordecai actually received, convincing him he'd been turned down too, so the two of them would stay together, unseparated, exactly as they'd always been. It's a lie small enough to tell in one afternoon and large enough, left uncorrected for years, to quietly steal an entire future out from under someone who never even knew it had been taken. In the alternate future the movie shows us before it's undone, that lie festers for decades into total estrangement. Future Mordecai, having eventually left the park anyway for a corporate career working directly for the villain, points a weapon at future Rigby and tells him, flatly, that they are not friends and haven't been for a long time, before shooting him as Rigby's ship departs on its rescue mission, killing him in the same motion that Rigby fires back and kills Mordecai in turn. That is the movie's actual future for these two characters, absent the intervention the plot exists to enable. Two men who spent the entire series being inseparable, dead by each other's hand, over a lie that started as an act of love, disguised as cowardice and calcified, given enough uncorrected time, into total mutual destruction. The film resolves it, of course, the same way most of Regular Show's darkest detours resolve, by having its present-day versions choose honesty and repair before the wound has the chance to set, erasing that future entirely, letting past Rigby confess the truth and past Mordecai forgive him before the lie ever gets the chance to become permanent. But the fact that the show's single largest scale production, the one meant to play as a celebratory feature-length event for its fan base, chose to build its emotional stakes around the two lead characters murdering each other in a future built entirely from one unaddressed act of dishonesty, tells you something clear about what the writers actually believed their show was about underneath the premise. It was never really about the cosmic threats. It was about what happens to a friendship when the small, ordinary dishonesties inside it, even the ones told out of love, are allowed to go unspoken for too long. Muscle Man deserves to be named specifically inside that pattern, because no single character on the show carries the tension between performed toughness and actual feeling quite as visibly as he does. This is a character built, on the surface, entirely out of bravado, a nickname he gave himself despite having no visible muscles to speak of, a signature joke about his mother that the show runs into the ground so many times across its run that the repetition itself becomes the joke, a persona of constant, aggressive confidence that almost never lines up with what he can actually do. And yet, this is also the character the show chooses to devastate more openly, more repeatedly than almost anyone else in the cast. We've already spent time with the specific way his father's death unfolds, the funeral tantrum, the discovered letter, the ghost's violent revenge on his behalf. But it's worth noticing that the show returns to Muscle Man crying, genuinely and without irony, more than once across its run, using the exact same performed toughness that makes him a punchline in his lighter episodes as the thing that makes his grief land harder in his heavier ones. Even his final line, before being erased in the show's own finale, that one last "my mom" joke delivered as he's being unmade from existence, works precisely because the show has spent years training its audience to read that specific joke as Muscle Man's armor, the thing he reaches for instead of saying something more vulnerable. Dying with the armor still on, rather than dropping it for one last profound statement, is, in its own way, one of the more honest character choices the show ever made. Not everyone gets a final moment of clarity. Some people just reach for the joke that's always worked, right up until the very end, because that joke was never really a deflection. It was who he actually was. The recurring portrayal of women across the show's run, meanwhile, occupies a related but distinct position worth naming, honestly, without overstating what the show explicitly says versus what the pattern implies. Margaret is steady, ambitious, and, by the show's own choice, eventually given a storyline where she leaves the park's orbit entirely to pursue journalism school, a decision the show treats with a level of respect that lets her exist as more than a prize to be won. Eileen is patient and plain-spoken in a way none of the male leads manage to be for most of the series, telling Rigby how she feels long before he's capable of hearing it, and the show lets that honesty function as a kind of quiet moral center rather than a joke about a girl with an unrequited crush. Neither of these choices is stated by the show as an explicit thesis about gender, but taken together Across 261 episodes, they add up to a pattern that's hard to miss. The women in this show are consistently given more emotional clarity than the men around them, and the men's growth, when it finally arrives, usually arrives specifically because a woman in their life refused to let them keep avoiding it. I want to sit for a moment on something else that runs underneath nearly every one of the darkest beats we've covered tonight, because once you notice it, you can't stop noticing it. This is a show that treats the threat of losing your job, and by extension, the threat of losing the park itself, with the same emotional register it uses for cosmic annihilation. This isn't speculation so much as a pattern that repeats across dozens of episodes, well documented across the show's run. Mordecai and Rigby, and by extension the rest of the staff, live in housing the park itself provides, in the same modest house, with the same cramped kitchen and the same overflowing junk drawer for the entire run of the series. They are, by any honest economic reading of the show's own text, precariously employed young adults with essentially no savings, no other prospects, and a boss who threatens termination with real, felt stakes in nearly every episode. The specific word fired, said in all capitals in the transcripts of episode after episode, functioning as the show's single most reliable source of dread, more consistent even than any given week's supernatural villain. When the park is threatened with closure, buyout, or demolition, which happens repeatedly across the show's run, the emotional temperature the show applies to that threat sits right alongside the emotional temperature it applies to actual apocalypse. And that's not the show being tonally inconsistent. That's the show being honest, in its own sideways way, about what unemployment and housing insecurity actually feel like from inside your 20s, when losing a job that barely pays anything can genuinely feel like the end of the only life you've managed to build. Think about what it would actually mean, materially, for Mordecai and Rigby to lose their jobs at the park. They don't have an apartment lease to fall back on because they don't have an apartment. The park's house is the only home either of them has. They don't have savings because the show never shows them earning enough to have any. They don't have a fallback career, a degree, a safety net of parents wealthy enough to catch them, not in any way the show ever establishes on screen. Getting fired from the park for these two characters wouldn't just mean a bad afternoon. It would mean simultaneous unemployment and homelessness, delivered in the same instant by the same conversation. The show never says this explicitly, in so many words, the way it says other things explicitly, like the literal cause of Muscle Dad's death or the literal mechanics of Skips's immortality deal. But it doesn't have to, because the stakes are baked so thoroughly into the premise that they don't require narration. Every single time Benson raises his voice about the possibility of termination, and it happens constantly in nearly every episode across all 8 seasons, the audience is watching two people's entire material existence hang on the outcome of whatever ludicrous crisis is currently unfolding, whether that crisis is a video game tournament or the actual literal end of the universe. The stakes were always, quietly, doubled. Every cosmic threat was stacked directly on the top of an economic anxiety. The show never had to explain to its audience, because most of that audience was living through some version of it in real time, watching from an apartment they also couldn't really afford at an hour when they should probably have been asleep already. That same reluctance to say true things out loud runs through nearly every one of the show's darkest episodes as a kind of connective tissue, even when the plot itself is ostensibly about something else entirely, a ghost or a demon or a highway exit ramp. Skips doesn't tell anyone about Mona until he's cornered into it by a direct question. Mr. Mailer doesn't explain what Pops actually is until the universe forces the reveal on him. Rigby doesn't confess the forged letter until a version of himself is already dying in front of him. The show's cosmology runs on secrets, kept out of love or fear or shame, and its horror runs on what happens once those secrets finally surface, usually far later and far more violently than an honest conversation held early would ever have required. Not every dark moment in this show needed a body count or a cosmic stake to land, and it's worth including at least one smaller example here, specifically to show how far down into ordinary guilt the writers were willing to go. Really Real Wrestling, an episode from the show's first season, has a premise that sounds like pure slapstick on paper. Mordecai and Rigby, roughhousing with Pops the way they roughhouse with everyone, accidentally injure him badly enough that he ends up needing real care, and the two of them, racked with guilt over having hurt someone as gentle and defenseless as Pops, give up tickets to the year's biggest wrestling event specifically to stay behind and nurse him back to health. There's no ghost in that episode, no cosmic villain, no negotiable death, no betrayed employee turning demonic. Just two young men who did something thoughtless to a person who trusted them completely, and who spend the rest of the episode sitting with the discomfort of having caused real, if minor, harm to somebody who never would have hurt them back. It's a small story, and it resolves gently, the way most of the show's smaller stories do. But it's worth naming specifically because it shows that regular show's interest in guilt, in the weight of having hurt someone you love, wasn't reserved only for its biggest cosmic set pieces. It lived just as comfortably in an episode about missing a wrestling match, because the writers seemed to understand that the emotional architecture of guilt doesn't actually change much based on the size of the mistake. It just changes size itself right alongside it. There's a structural pattern worth pausing on before we go any further, because once you see it laid out side by side across the episodes we've already covered, it's difficult to unsee. Regular show returns again and again to the idea of a person confronted by a darker, more violent version of someone they should have been able to trust completely, and it leans on that confrontation as its go-to engine for genuine horror far more often than it leans on any traditional monster. Garrett Bobby Ferguson Jr. is, in a very literal sense, his father's unfinished business given a new body and a fresh grievance. Susan, in Benson Be Gone, is what a bad boss looks like once you strip away the metaphor and let the demon underneath be an actual demon. The brainwashed Skips in Exit 9B, hands closing around the throats of two people he's spent years protecting, is Skips with the only thing that makes him safe, his memory, his history, his grief for Mona temporarily deleted from him. In Regular Show, the movie takes that same pattern to its most extreme conclusion, showing us a future Mordecai who is recognizably, physically, vocally still Mordecai, and who has nonetheless become someone willing to shoot his oldest friend to dead over a betrayal that in another timeline never gets the chance to fully calcify. None of these are traditional villains, dropped in from outside to be defeated and forgotten. They're closer to warnings, dressed up as plot, about what happens to the people you love most when grief or resentment or corporate ambition or one small unaddressed lie is allowed to run unchecked for long enough. The scariest thing this show ever imagined, more consistently than any ghost or zombie or cosmic warlord, was somebody you trust completely, wearing a version of themselves you no longer recognize. That doubling becomes impossible to miss once the show enters its final stretch, in what fans and critics alike refer to as the space arc, which dominates roughly the back third of the series. I want to be careful here to separate documented production fact from fan interpretation, because there's a real, sourced story behind why this shift happened, and there's also a layer of speculation the fandom has built on top of it that deserves to be labeled as such. Here's what's actually documented. J.G. Quintel has said in an interview with Animation Magazine, published around the time the finale aired, that the creative team began to sense the show's ending was coming during the making of Season 7, when the network's renewal for an additional season came in smaller than what they'd received previously. Quintel has stated plainly that he told the network from early on that he wanted advance warning if the show was ending, specifically so the ending could be built properly rather than the show simply being cut off mid-story. That's not speculation. That's the creator, on the record, describing exactly how and when he learned the clock was running out, and describing his own explicit intention to use that knowledge to build towards something. He's also said, in a separate interview conducted around the release of his follow-up show, Close Enough, that by the time Regular Show was ending, he had gotten married and started a family, and that the show, which had originally been modeled on his own 20s, spent slacking off with friends after college, no longer reflected who he actually was anymore. Rigby's voice actor, William Salyers, is quoted via a second-hand account that circulated on the show's fan community and has been repeated in entertainment coverage of the show's ending, saying that Quintel felt, after 6 years, that he had told the story of Regular Show up through its natural ending point, and didn't want to keep living in that creative space past the point where it still felt true to him. All of that is sourced, on the record, verifiable. What fans have built on top of that documented account, and this part is genuinely speculative, unconfirmed by any official statement, is the theory that the tonal escalation of the space arc, the way the park is physically ripped off the planet and turned into a fugitive vessel, the way the villains scale up from petty suburban annoyances into cosmic warlords capable of erasing entire planets, was in some part a response to that same sense of narrowing time, a creative team choosing to spend its last remaining episodes saying everything it had left to say about these characters at the largest possible scale, because it knew it wouldn't get another chance. That reading is plausible. It lines up with the documented timeline, but it remains an interpretation, not a confirmed fact. And I want to be honest with you about that distinction, because the difference between what a creator has said on the record and what an audience has inferred from the shape of the finished work matters, even when the inference feels obviously right. What's harder to dismiss as mere interpretation is simply watching what the space arc actually does to its characters emotionally, independent of any theory about why the writers chose to do it. For years, the entire identity of this show had been rooted in one specific, unglamorous physical location: a modest park, an old house, a rundown cart, a coffee shop down the road. The space arc takes all of that away, physically, on screen, tearing the literal ground the show had stood on for years out from under its own cast, and it never lets that loss feel small. The crew spends years, in universe, displaced, fighting for survival across a hostile galaxy, and the show is careful, in scene after scene, to let them be tired of it, homesick for it, openly wishing out loud to go onto a place most of them used to complain about constantly when they still had it. There's something worth sitting with in that reversal on its own terms, independent of any theory about production timelines. A show can spend years building a case that its characters are stuck, restless, wasting their best years in a job and a place too small for them, and then spend its final stretch proving, through nothing but plain, uncomplicated grief, that the small place was the thing worth having all along. When the park finally does return to Earth, restored but visibly changed, the show doesn't stage it as simple triumph. It stages it as a homecoming heavy enough that the joy and the exhaustion arrive in the same breath. What is documented, plainly, in the finale itself, a regular epic final battle, a 3-part special that aired across January 16th, 2017, split into segments titled Part 1, Part 2, and The Power is This. Pops, revealed across the final season to be a cosmic being named Megacranus, born specifically to maintain universal balance against an equally cosmic evil twin named Antipops, or Malum Cranus, travels to his homeworld to fight that twin in a battle that has apparently played out across countless prior cosmic cycles, always ending in a stalemate that resets the universe rather than resolving anything. Before the fight, in the preceding episode Cheer Up Pops, which aired the same day as part of the same event, the show gives us one of its quietest, most unbearable character beats. Mordecai and Rigby greet Pops as normal, and Pops simply breaks down crying, unprompted out of nowhere, a grown man, or a cosmic being wearing the shape of one, dissolving into open grief in front of his friends because he knows what is coming and cannot pretend otherwise anymore. The rest of the episode is the staff trying, and largely failing, to cheer him up individually before settling on throwing him a party, during which the show includes a detail that reads, once you notice it, as an act of preparation for death rather than celebration. The crew has their memories uploaded onto physical discs specifically so that some record of their lives will survive, regardless of what happens in the battle to come. That's not subtext. The show states this plainly, in dialogue, as the stated reason for the memory upload. It is a group of friends backing up their own existence because they don't know if they're all walking away from what's coming. It's worth sitting a moment longer inside Cheer Up Pops before moving into the battle itself, because the episode's quietest scene is, in some ways, harder to watch than anything that follows it. Once the party the crew throws finally succeeds in lifting Pops's mood, if only briefly, the show gives us the detail about the memory discs again, this time letting it breathe rather than rushing past it. Blu-ray, one of the show's recurring robotic characters, warns everyone specifically not to touch their own uploaded memories once they're saved to disk. A warning Rigby, of course, ignores almost immediately, nearly getting the entire party vaporized in the process, which is the show doing what it always does, using a joke to keep a genuinely morbid premise from becoming unbearable to sit inside. But once the memories are safely stored, Pop starts crying again, and this time he tells his friends, through the tears, that they're happy ones. That single correction, happy tears, not sad ones, is doing an enormous amount of quiet work. It's a person who knows he may be about to die, surrounded by the people he loves most, choosing in that exact moment to feel grateful rather than afraid, not because the fear has gone away, but because he's decided, consciously, to let gratitude sit louder than it for however long he has left. That's not a small thing to ask an audience of children and adults to sit with on a Monday holiday afternoon broadcast. It's one of the more emotionally mature ideas the show ever tried to communicate, delivered in 11 minutes, wrapped in jokes about disc formats. The battle itself, once it arrives, does not pull its punches either, and I wanted to describe what actually happens rather than soften it. As the fight escalates, Anti-Pops reaches a level of power sufficient to begin erasing the battlefield and everyone on it from existence. Muscle Man and High Five Ghost are caught directly in that erasing wave. Muscle Man's final line, delivered as he is being unmade, is one more of his running "my mom" jokes, the show choosing, in the single most serious moment of its entire run, to let a beloved comic character's very layered words be a joke, because that is sometimes exactly what people do in the last seconds they have. Reach for the thing that always made everyone laugh rather than for something more solemn. Pops, watching his friends erased in front of him, is consumed by a grief-fueled rage that finally unlocks his full cosmic power, and the fight scales up further, ultimately claiming nearly every named ally the show had built across 8 seasons, undone in the same erasing wave, until only Mordecai and Rigby remain as witnesses. And then, in the sequence that actually resolves the entire series, Pops realizes something the show frames as the emotional key to the whole finale. That fighting his brother in the conventional sense will only produce another stalemate, another reset, another cycle where nothing is actually solved, and the same battle happens again in some future incarnation. So instead, he grabs Anti-Pops directly and flies with him into the nearest star. And in the seconds before that impact, something the TV Tropes recap of the episode and multiple other outlets describe plainly happens. The two brothers reconcile. Anti-Pops, For the first time in the entire history of their cosmic conflict, is shown something like remorse. The two of them are, in the show's own words, finally at peace before they fly into the sun together. Pops dies. The show does not undo that. There is no last-second resurrection, no reveal that he secretly survived, no magic reset that brings him back the way the show had, throughout its run, brought characters back from death so casually, so repeatedly, that death itself had almost stopped meaning anything within the show's internal logic. Death had been negotiable for 8 seasons. Skips could arm wrestle it back. A ghost could get his son back from a cosmic order. But Pops's death, in the finale, is the one death the show refuses to make negotiable, and that refusal is, I think, the single darkest and most serious choice the entire series ever made, precisely because of how loudly it contradicts everything the show had trained its audience to expect. With the cycle of resets broken by that act of reconciliation rather than victory, everyone else who had been erased is restored. The park staff spend 3 years in space before returning to Earth, where they're welcomed home as heroes, and the park itself, along with Mr. Maillard, erects a memorial statue in Pops's honor. And then, in a sequence the AV Club's review at the time flagged as probably a little intense for some younger viewers, the show jumps forward across years, showing its entire cast growing older, quitting the park, building separate adult lives that still occasionally circle back to one another. Mordecai becomes a successful painter, marries a bat named Steph, someone the audience had never met before, deliberately sidestepping both of his long-running love interests, and has 3 children with her. Rigby finishes the high school diploma he'd spent the whole show avoiding, marries Eileen, and has a family. Benson finds a quieter domestic life with a character named Pam. The show closes, ultimately, on ordinary lives, small and slow and glamorous, built by people the show spent years watching fail to grow up, until, apparently, they finally did. It's worth lingering on the specific texture of that closing montage a little longer, because the choice of music underneath it is doing almost as much emotional work as the images themselves. The sequence showing the park staff scattering into their separate adult lives, aging forward across years in a handful of quick cuts, is scored to David Bowie's Heroes, a song written, famously, about 2 people choosing to love each other in the shadow of something enormous and uncontrollable, which makes it a strange and quietly devastating choice to lay under a montage of ordinary people simply growing older together. The show doesn't just tell you time has passed, it shows you, in the animation itself, the same simple character designs the show had used for 8 straight years, quietly reworked to carry the weight of years none of these characters had lived through on screen before. Creases where there had only ever been flat color, a slower way of moving, glasses appearing on a face that had never needed them. It's a small technical choice, redrawing character models the animators had spent nearly a decade perfecting in one specific, youthful register, and choosing instead to let them look genuinely older, genuinely worn, rather than simply aging them the easy way with a haircut or a costume change. Benson ends up with a character named Pam, The two of them shown raising animals rather than children, a small, deliberately unglamorous kind of domestic happiness. High Five Ghost builds a life and a DJ career alongside a partner named Celia, gaining, in the show's own visual shorthand for adulthood, a soul patch and a beanie, still recognizably himself, but visibly, gently changed by the years. Muscle Man, we learn, comes home from the years spent in space to discover his wife gave birth to a daughter during his absence, and by the time the reunion sequence arrives, he's already a grandfather. Skips, notably, is the one member of the crew the show does not pair off with anyone new, a detail multiple outlets have flagged plainly. He remains, by every visual and narrative indication, unattached, which lines up quietly and without any explicit statement from the show itself with everything Skip's story had already told us about exactly one woman, centuries gone, still being the only name he reaches for. And the sequence closes on a park staff reunion, 25 years on, where Mordecai and Rigby, both visibly aged, Mordecai now wearing glasses and a beard, wander off from the gathered crowd specifically to dig up some of their old video game cabinets, playing together one more time, a small act of returning to exactly the kind of aimless, unhurried afternoon the entire show had spent its run defending as worth protecting. I want to be honest about where fact ends and reading begins on that ending, because a lot of what makes it land the way it does is genuinely a matter of interpretation rather than something the show states outright. It is documented, factually, that Pops dies, that the reconciliation happens, that the time skip occurs, that these specific character outcomes are shown on screen. What is interpretation, and what I want to flag clearly as such, is the broader reading many critics and fans have arrived at independently, that the finale functions as the show's argument that forgiveness, not victory, is the only force capable of actually ending a cycle of harm, that Pops doesn't win the fight so much as he refuses to keep having it, and that this refusal, dressed up as an action-adventure climax, is really a statement about how destructive cycles, generational or cosmic or otherwise, only end when someone decides to stop feeding them rather than when someone finally wins. That reading isn't confirmed by any interview or official statement I could locate. It's an inference, a strong and repeatedly made one, but an inference, and I want you to hold it the way the show itself seems to want you to hold most of its heaviest ideas, firmly but with an open hand, mister. Maillard deserves his own stop on this walk, because the show plants the seeds of its darkest emotional reveal in an episode that plays, on first watch, like pure sitcom filler. Dizzy, airing in January of 2011 during the show's second season, is the first time the audience ever meets Mr. Maillard at all, and the introduction tells you everything about the emotional architecture the show would spend 7 more years slowly filling in. Maillard, a harsh, wealthy businessman who owns the park outright, arrives specifically to make Pops, revealed here for the first time to be his son, deliver a speech in front of a crowd of Maillard's own distinguished friends. Pops, crushed by stage fright, runs away crying rather than face it, and Maillard's response, delivered to Benson directly, is a threat. Find Pops and get him in front of that crowd, or every single employee at the park is fired. That's the first real information the show ever gives its audience about how this man treats the people around him, and it lands as pure comedy in the moment. A blustering rich boss making an unreasonable demand. It's only years later, once the show reveals in its final season that Pops is not merely Maillard's son, but a cosmic being named Megacranus, born specifically to fight a war that could end the universe, that this early scene recontextualizes itself entirely. A man who spent years appearing cruel and impatient with everyone except one particular employee turns out to have been, the entire time, a father raising a child he knew, on some level, was destined for something no ordinary parent could protect him from, hiding him in plain sight inside the shape of an ordinary park, an ordinary staff, an ordinary Father's Day speech about a statue. And there is a small, quietly devastating detail confirmed in the show's own finale material and repeated across fan documentation of the ending. Mr. Maillard is shown to outlive his son, dying, according to the timeline the finale lays out, roughly 25 years after Pops' death in the battle against Anti-Pops, meaning this is a father who does not get to go first. He watches his son die to save the universe, and then keeps living in the world that death purchased for another quarter century without him. That same darkly comic instinct for hiding something genuinely sinister behind a workplace sitcom premise shows up again in Benson Be Gone, an episode in which Maillard, blaming Benson for a mess Mordecai and Rigby actually caused, demotes him and hires a new park manager named Susan to replace him. Susan proves far worse than Benson ever was, systematically turning the rest of the park's employees into obedient clones of herself, stripping them of the very personalities that made the park worth working at in the first place, until Benson, having gone to seek advice from a previous park manager who quit the business entirely to become what the show calls, without much elaboration needed, a full-time slacker, returns to break the spell by ordering everyone to slack off again, restoring their individuality through sheer defiance of productivity. Susan, cornered, reveals what she actually is. Not a corporate hire at all, but a demon who grows to giant size in the episode's climax. It's a plot that plays, structurally, as a workplace satire about soul-crushing management culture and the loss of identity that comes with a toxic new boss, and it resolves that satire literally by making the toxic boss a genuine demon from some other layer of reality, because regular show rarely bothered drawing a hard line between the metaphorical horror of a bad job and the literal, cosmic kind. There's a smaller, quieter darkness worth naming here too, one that doesn't come from any single episode, but from the accumulated shape of the whole series once you look back at it from the other end. The show's relationship to its own audience seems to have shifted somewhere in its middle seasons. From a comedy aimed loosely at kids with jokes adults could also enjoy, into something closer to a show that understood, consciously or not, that a significant portion of its actual audience was watching in their 20s, alone, late at night, the way a lot of us are watching right now. The recurring motif of characters falling asleep, dreaming, crossing into other worlds through sleep, treated across multiple episodes as a kind of cosmic threshold rather than mere metaphor, reads differently once you know how many people used this show across its entire run, specifically to fall asleep to. That's not something the show ever announces directly. It's a pattern, documented in the sheer volume of fan testimony across forums and comment sections over the years, and it's part of why a show ostensibly for children ended up carrying this much emotional weight for the adults who grew up alongside it. It kept meeting its audience at whatever hour they actually showed up, and it never talked down to whatever they were carrying when they did. Part of why all of this lands the way it does, I think, has to do with choices that have nothing to do with plot at all. Choices about how the show actually looks and moves and sounds. And this next part is closer to interpretation than hard documented fact, though it's a reading grounded in things that are genuinely true about the show's visual language. Regular show's animation is, by design, understated. The character designs are simple, almost primitive in the friendliest sense of that word, flat shapes and minimal detail, the kind of design language you'd expect from a show that wants to be easy to draw quickly and cheaply for a network budget. But the backgrounds, in contrast, are painted with a soft, almost watercolor adjacent quality, gentle gradients of color, painterly light falling across grass and pavement and the sides of the old house, and that contrast between simple foreground and richly atmospheric background is doing something specific to how the show feels to sit inside. It doesn't look like you're watching something happen in real time. It looks, more than almost any other comparable animated comedy of its era, like you're remembering something, the way an actual memory softens detail at the edges while keeping a few specific things impossibly sharp. That quality is part of why the show's darker moments land with the particular ache they land with, rather than simple shock. You're not just watching a zombie climb out of a grave or a father's ghost take revenge on the men who mocked him. You're watching it through a visual filter that already feels, on some pre-verbal level, like something being recalled rather than something happening, which means even the show's most violent or frightening beats arrive with a strange built-in gentleness, the same gentleness you'd apply to a memory of something that scared you once, a long time ago, that you've since made peace with. The show's pacing works in a similar direction, and this part is closer to simple observable fact than interpretation. Regular show, especially in its earlier seasons, moves at the speed of an actual lazy afternoon. Long stretches of episodes are given over to Mordecai and Rigby simply sitting together, playing a video game, complaining about a task neither of them wants to do, filling silence with the kind of low-stakes banter real friends actually use to pass unstructured time. That unhurried rhythm is a large part of why so many people, across years of fan testimony documented in comment sections and forum threads, have used this show specifically to fall asleep to, the same way you're maybe using this video right now. And it means that when the show does drop into something genuinely dark, a death, a betrayal, a memory of grief that's been building for centuries, it drops into a rhythm that has already trained your nervous system to feel safe, to feel like nothing bad is coming, because for the last 10 minutes, nothing much has been happening at all beyond two friends sitting on a couch. The horror, when it arrives inside a room the show has spent the whole episode convincing you was safe, and that's not a coincidence. That's craft, deployed patiently, episode after episode, until an audience of people watching half asleep in the dark had no defenses left up at all. There's a small, almost bureaucratic detail worth sitting with here too, because it says something about how the network itself seemed to understand what it was airing. Every single episode we've talked about tonight, Grave Sites, Trucker Hall of Fame, Skip's Story, Exit 9B, the Christmas Special, all 6 installments of Terror Tales of the Park, carried the same content rating, TVPG, the same rating given to the show's lightest, silliest, most inconsequential episodes about video game tournaments and Christmas sweaters. There was no special advisory bump for the episode where a father's ghost commits vehicular homicide against a group of truckers. No additional warning for the episode where an on-screen character watches her boyfriend become immortal in the same scene she dies in. The AV Club's own review of Skip's Story, written at the time the episode aired, put the tension plainly, noting that the show seemed to be brushing right up against the edge of what a network aimed at children would normally allow, and that observation is worth taking seriously rather than treating as just a critic's turn of phrase. A show can carry a rating that tells parents it's appropriate for children and still, week after week, quietly test exactly how much real weight that rating can bear before something has to give. Regular Show tested that boundary for 8 years and never once had to give. None of this, I think, contradicts the show's reputation as one of the warmer, gentler animated comedies of its era. If anything, the darkness makes the warmth make more sense. A show that let a father's ghost take bloody revenge for his son's sake, that let an immortal man weep over a locket containing a photograph of a woman dead for centuries, that let its own supposedly comic relief mascot cry before walking into a fight he knew would kill him, and that then, having shown you all of that, still ended on ordinary people building ordinary lives out of the wreckage of everything they'd survived, was never really a show that avoided darkness. It was a show that walked directly into it over and over, and then chose every single time to come back out the other side towards something gentle. That choice, repeated across 8 seasons and 261 episodes, is the actual thing Regular Show was doing the whole time it looked like it was doing something much smaller. There's one more piece of context worth including before we come back around to why any of this actually matters, and it's a small, almost administrative fact that nonetheless says something real about how the show has aged. Regular Show has continued to live on well past its original broadcast run, available for streaming on services like Hulu and Max in the years since, meaning the show's afterlife has been, in practical terms, longer than its original run ever was. New viewers keep finding it. Old viewers keep returning to it, often specifically based on years of accumulated fan testimony across forums and comment threads, as something to fall asleep to, the same impulse that likely brought at least some of you here tonight. A show built to run for 6 or 7 years on a children's network has instead settled into something closer to permanent ambient culture, discovered and rediscovered by people who were toddlers when it first aired and by people who watched it the first time around and are now, themselves, old enough to have kids watching it too. That kind of afterlife isn't something a show earns by being merely pleasant. It's something a show earns by having actually meant something to the people who sat with it. And a show only means something by being willing, every so often, to stop being funny for just long enough to be true. There's a version of this whole video that could have been made as a simple list, 10 or 20 scary or sad moments counted off in order of severity, ranked and ranked again, and I think that version would have missed the actual thing worth understanding about why any of this landed the way it did. It was never really about any single episode. It was about the accumulation, the sheer repeated willingness, across 261 episodes and 8 years and one dying network deal, to let something true and heavy and occasionally violent sit in the middle of a frame that was supposedly built for children, and then to trust that same frame to hold it, week after week, without collapsing under the weight. A father's ghost taking bloody revenge for his son. A woman dying on prom night so completely that the man who loved her would rather live forever than feel that particular loss twice. A cosmic being crowning before the fight he knows will kill him, and then correcting himself, gently, to make sure his last tears were happy ones. A future built entirely from one small unspoken lie, ending in two best friends shooting each other dead. None of that is small, none of that is what you'd expect, walking in from a cartoon about a blue jay and a raccoon who work at a park. And maybe that's the actual point worth sitting with as we come to the end of this one, something closer to a feeling than a fact. And I want to be honest that this last part is my own reading, rather than anything the show or its creators ever stated directly. Shows built for young people are so often assumed to need protecting from real weight, from grief, from mortality, from the genuine cost of loving someone you're eventually going to lose. Regular show, quietly, patiently, without ever making a speech about it, seemed to disagree with that assumption almost every single week it aired. It let its youngest viewers sit with real death, real heartbreak, real betrayal, real fear, and it never once explained those things away afterward with an easy moral or a tidy reset. It just moved forward, the way people actually have to move forward, carrying what happened along with them into whatever came next. That's not a small gift to give an audience, especially one that, as the years went on, turned out to include a great many 20-somethings who were carrying real weight of their own, alone, in an apartment they couldn't quite afford, at 2 a.m, with the television on for company. The show met them there. It never once talked down to whatever they were bringing into the room with them. And it kept doing that, faithfully, every single week, until the day it finally, deliberately, on its own terms, said goodbye. If you made it this far with me tonight, through the graveyards and the ghosts and the stars, through a father's revenge and a woman's locket, and a god crying happy tears before a fight he knew would end him, thank you for spending these hours in the park with me. If this is the kind of thing you want more of, hit subscribe. It genuinely helps keep these going, and I'll see you back here for the next one. Sleep well.